Have you ever witnessed cruelty so heartless it made your stomach turn? When a quiet young girl in a wheelchair was mocked and humiliated at a small-town diner, nobody thought twice about her pain. But exactly 1 hour later, the roar of engines filled the street, and when the Hells Angels stepped through the door, every single person learned a lesson in respect they would never forget. She sat near the back corner of the diner, hoping that by being invisible, she might escape the judgmental stares. Her name was Lily, and though she was only 17, her life had already been shaped by trials no child should endure. Polio had stolen her mobility when she was a toddler, and ever since, the wheelchair seemed to define her more than any of her dreams or talents. The regulars in the diner barely glanced her way, unless it was to shift uncomfortably, as though her very presence reminded them of life's cruel unpredictability. She kept her gaze fixed on the menu, her fingers worrying the edge of the laminated paper. The diner's warm air smelled of bacon and coffee, but to Lily it felt like a suffocating cage. Some customers preferred to pretend she wasn't there at all. Others offered that hollow, pitying smile people wear when they don't know what to say but want to feel better about themselves. Lily had grown used to it, the casual dismissal. The discomfort she seemed to create by simply existing in a place she had every right to be. On that morning, she told herself she would order breakfast and try to feel normal for once. But deep down, she already sensed that no matter how hard she tried, this small town would never let her forget she was different. She drew a slow breath, steeling herself for another hour of strained politeness, and the quiet ache of being the girl nobody wanted to see. It started as a whisper, just a couple of teenage boys in the booth across the aisle, nudging each other and smirking in her direction. Lily didn't look up, hoping if she pretended not to notice, they'd lose interest and go back to their greasy plates of pancakes. Ow. But their whispers grew louder, morphing into laughter, sharp enough to cut through the clinking dishes and soft hum of the jukebox. One of them exaggerated a limp as he walked past her table to the counter, his friends snickering behind their hands. The sound rolled through the diner like a mean-spirited echo, and the hush that followed was almost worse because no one stepped in to stop it. For a long moment, Lily sat frozen, her cheeks burning as if she were a spectacle in some cruel sideshow. Even the cook, visible through the pass window, pretended to be too busy flipping bacon to notice. The boys returned to their seats, still giggling, their shoulders shaking with the glee of people who had never been taught the cost of unkindness. The other diners kept their heads down, stirring their coffee, quietly relieved that the cruelty wasn't directed at them. Lily's hands fumbled in her lap as she tried to pretend the tears pooling in her eyes were nothing but dust. She was used to the sting of casual meanness, but this time it carved a deeper wound, one she feared might never fully heal. Hannah, the waitress, had worked at the diner for nearly 10 years. She prided herself on her ability to handle just about anything. A rush of orders, the grumbling complaints of regulars, and the occasional kitchen mishap. But as she watched the boys mock Lily, she felt her own composure unravel. She set the coffee pot down with trembling hands, torn between her duty to remain professional and her urge to walk over and tell them to stop. The manager, a tired man with a mortgage and 2 kids, had made it clear. Don't provoke the local teenagers. They're the sons of the town's wealthiest families, and their parents' money keeps the diner afloat during slow months. Hannah hated herself for hesitating. She knew she should say something, anything, to defend the girl sitting alone with her humiliation. But the fear of losing her job was real, and she swallowed the words that rose bitter in her throat. She tried to meet Lily's eyes to offer some silent apology, yet Lily never looked up. Instead, the girl's shoulders seemed to fold inward, as if she were trying to disappear altogether. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and turned away, her heart sick with shame. It was easier to pretend she hadn't seen it at all, easier to convince herself she had no choice. But deep down, she knew she had failed in the simplest test of decency, and that failure would haunt her long after the morning crowd dispersed. Bolstered by the lack of consequences, the boys grew bolder. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth and called across the diner, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Hey, do you need help rolling over here? Maybe we can give you a push." His friends howled, delighted with their performance. The cruel chorus turned heads, but no one moved to intervene. Lily felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd never felt so exposed, so utterly powerless. Her fingers dug into the armrest of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. All she had wanted was a quiet breakfast, a small moment of ordinary life, and instead she had become a target. As the laughter rose, so did her shame. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, the sympathetic ones and the ones that looked away in embarrassment. She heard a woman near the counter whisper, "Someone should do something." But the woman didn't rise from her seat. The manager stayed hidden in the back. The cook kept flipping eggs, and Hannah pretended to refill a sugar container that didn't need refilling. Lily's chest ached with the effort of holding back sobs. It was as if the entire world had decided her dignity was an acceptable sacrifice to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation. In that moment, she understood that cruelty rarely worked alone. It thrived in the silence of those who watched and did nothing. Lily didn't remember when the first tear finally slipped free. Maybe it was after the boys mimicked the squeak of her wheels, or when the entire corner booth erupted in laughter at her expense. She sat there trembling, her hands curled into her lap, her shoulders quaking as she tried to stop the sobs building in her throat. The humiliation was total a thick fog she couldn't see through. Every second felt like an hour. Every laugh, another wound to endure in silence. Determined not to give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry aloud, Lily bit her lips so hard she tasted copper. Around her, the diner continued to operate as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Plates clattered, silverware chimed, and coffee dripped steadily into mugs. But to Lily, it was all background noise to the roaring in her ears, the sound of her own heartbeat thudding in terror and shame. She pressed a trembling hand to her cheek, wiping away the tears as quickly as they came. All she wanted was to disappear, to somehow slip out the door without anyone noticing. But the wheelchair made that impossible. She was stuck there, pinned by her own vulnerability, while strangers decided whether she was worth defending. Never felt so alone in all her life. While Lily struggled to keep her composure, her phone buzzed quietly on the table. She almost ignored it, too afraid her shaking hands would drop it if she picked it up. But something in her heart, some tiny flicker of desperation, made her reach for it anyway. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and squinted at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, one she'd never seen before. For a second, she thought it was another prank call. She'd had her share of those too. But something compelled her to swipe and answer. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said hello. On the other end came a low rumble she didn't understand, a voice she couldn't quite place. "Hang tight, little sister," the voice said, gravelly but gentle. "We're on our way." The line went dead before she could reply. She stared at the phone, confusion mingling with dread. What did that mean? Who was we? A fresh wave of fear rose in her chest. She looked up, expecting the boys to be watching her again. But for once, they seemed absorbed in their own laughter. She had no idea that the call would become the first domino in a chain of events destined to change her life, and the entire town forever. Outside the diner's wide front windows, the July sun poured down on cracked pavement. A heat haze shimmered off the empty parking lot, and the only movement was a stray dog nosing around the trash bins. Slowly, so slowly, that no one noticed at first, things began to shift. A pair of gleaming chrome headlights appeared at the far end of the street, followed by the low growl of an engine. Then another, and another. Hannah, wiping down a booth by the window, squinted into the glare. For a moment, she thought it was just a couple of bikers passing through, nothing unusual on a summer morning. But the engines didn't roll past. They turned deliberately into the lot and lined up with the precision of soldiers. Lily didn't see them arrive. She was too busy trying to steady her breathing, still clutching her phone like a talisman. The rest of the diner fell gradually quiet, an uneasy hush of people sensing something was about to happen. One of the boys who had been laughing turned to look out the window. His smirk flickered, replaced by dawning confusion. The engines outside kept coming, filling the lot with a thunderous chorus that rattled the diner's glass panes. By the time the last bike rolled to a stop, there were more than 20 of them, chrome and leather, lined up like a wall of silent judgment, waiting to descend. The engines didn't cut off right away. They idled there, rumbling and growling, primal sound that rolled through the air like an oncoming storm. You didn't just hear it. You felt it in your chest, in your bones, and in the pit of your stomach. Even the cook leaned out of the pass window, his spatula frozen in midair. No one dared speak. The boys who had mocked Lily shifted in their booth. Her laughter was gone, replaced by something tight and nervous. Lily finally looked up, startled by the vibration of the glass. She blinked through her tears, her gaze drifting past Hannah's stunned face to the rows of motorcycles gleaming under the sun. For a heartbeat, she didn't understand what she was seeing. It felt impossible that any of this had to do with her. She clutched her phone tighter, the memory of the raspy voice whispering, "We're on our way," echoing in her mind. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Not quite hope yet, but the sense that she was no longer as alone as she had believed. One by one, the bikers dismounted. They moved with a quiet confidence that was almost more intimidating than any show of aggression. Sunlight glinted off their helmets as they pulled them free, revealing weathered faces and solemn eyes. Each wore the same black leather vest, stitched with a patch everyone in town recognized, but had only seen in movies or whispered rumors. Hell's Angels. A name alone carried a kind of mythic weight, equal parts fear and fascination. They stood in a loose formation, scanning the diner windows with a cold, measured scrutiny. Inside, the atmosphere tightened until it felt like the air itself had thickened. The boys' bravado shriveled in an instant. They exchanged nervous glances, their shoulders curling inward, as if to shield themselves from the biker's gaze. Hannah swallowed hard, her heart hammering as she wondered if she should lock the door, though some small part of her knew it was far too late for that. Lily's breath caught. For a moment, she almost felt afraid, too afraid of what might happen, afraid of being seen. But then she saw one of the bikers nod to her through the window. His expression was neither pitying nor cruel, just respectful, as though he knew exactly why he was there. When the door finally swung open, the little bell overhead gave a cheerful jingle that felt almost absurd in the charged stillness. One by one, the bikers filed inside, their boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The diner wasn't big to begin with, and their presence seemed to swallow all the space and air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the jukebox, which had been playing an old Johnny Cash tune, went silent when the cook yanked the cord from the wall. The boys who had tormented Lily sank lower in their booth, their eyes darting anywhere but toward the entrance. The lead biker, a tall man with a braided gray beard and a face that looked carved from weathered oak, surveyed the room in one slow sweep. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The weight of his stare alone was enough to pin every last customer in place. He turned his gaze to Lily's table, and in that moment, something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement that she had been seen. For Lily, it was like the air returned to her lungs all at once. Cruel laughter had ended. The humiliation had been interrupted. Though she didn't understand exactly why these men were here, she felt for the first time that morning that she was no longer alone. The tall man with the braided gray beard took a few measured steps forward, until he stood almost directly in front of Lily's table. He didn't tower over her in a way that felt threatening, simply occupied space with a kind of calm authority that drew every eye in the room. His vest bore the unmistakable Hell's Angels insignia on the back, and beneath it, the name Reverend was stitched in neat block letters. He looked at Lily, and for a moment, all the other people, all the cruel boys, and all the sidelong glances disappeared. He inclined his head in a gesture that felt as old-fashioned as it was respectful. "Miss," he said, his voice steady and low. "We heard there was trouble." He didn't elaborate on how or why he had heard. He didn't need to. The certainty in his tone made it clear that this wasn't some coincidence. He had come here for her. Behind him, the other bikers stood like a silent phalanx, their presence an unspoken promise that the days of suffering alone were over. For a long moment, no one dared breathe. Even Hannah, clutching the edge of the counter, felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never seen anyone stand up for that girl. Not like this. Not with such unflinching purpose. The boys who had spent the morning jeering now looked as though they'd gladly sink right through the cracked vinyl of their booth. Their leader, Reverend, didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. In a tone as soft as it was lethal, he asked a question that seemed to echo off every wall. "Which of you," he said, turning his gaze to Travis's table, "thought it was a good idea to treat this young lady like she was less than you?" His words hung in the air, as heavy as a stone dropped into still water. No one answered. The only sound was the muted hum of the refrigeration unit and Lily's own heartbeat thumping in her ears. It was a question that demanded more than an explanation. It demanded the truth of who they really were. Travis's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came. His friends shifted in their seats, all but squirming. Some of the older customers, people who had known Lily since she was small, couldn't quite meet the Reverend's eyes either, because in their silence, in their unwillingness to act, they too had allowed this cruelty to fester. Hannah felt a lump rise in her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron, wishing she had been braver. Reverend didn't move, didn't blink. He simply waited, patient as a judge. And in that long, terrible pause, everyone understood that the bikers were not here to cause chaos. They were here to hold up a mirror and make the town look at itself. Perhaps, or a kind of moral gravity that made no room for excuses. Respect, he said slowly, is not a gift you give to people who look like you, walk like you, or live like you. It's a birthright, and when you take it from someone, you dishonor yourself most of all. His words landed like hammer blows on the brittle arrogance of the boys in the booth. But he didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply told the truth as plainly as if he were reciting scripture. Lily felt something shift inside her chest. Some tight, raw place that had never been touched by kindness opened for the first time that morning. Tears welled again, but this time, they were not tears of shame. Around the diner, other people looked down at their plates, their faces flushed with a recognition they hadn't been prepared to feel. This wasn't just about the boys. It was about all of them, the whole town that had quietly allowed a child to be humiliated, because it was easier to stay silent. The bikers had come to deliver more than protection. They'd come to remind everyone what dignity looked like, and how quickly it could be stolen when good people did nothing. For a long time, Lily couldn't find her voice. She felt small and enormous at once, as if she were watching her own life unfold from somewhere outside her body. But then she realized every eye in the diner had turned to her not with pity, not with disgust, but with something she had almost stopped believing existed. Respect. She drew a shaking breath. When she spoke, her voice was thin but steady, threading through the hush like the first light after a storm. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her eyes fixed on the boys who had tormented her. "I just wanted breakfast." Her words were not an accusation. They were a simple statement of fact, and that made them all the more powerful. A hush settled deeper around her, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. "You don't have to like me," she continued, "but you don't get to decide that I don't matter." Her hands trembled on her lap, but she held her chin high. For the first time in her life, she felt something like pride in her own voice. The bikers behind Reverend nodded as though she'd said exactly what they had come to hear. In that moment, Lily understood. No roar of vengeance, no leather jackets, and no show of force could ever be as strong as the quiet truth spoken by someone who had suffered enough. Hannah felt the weight in her chest crack open. She had spent the entire morning trapped in a paralysis of fear, afraid of losing her job, afraid of angering the wrong people. But as she watched Lily speak, something inside her broke free. She set down her coffee pot and stepped out from behind the counter, her palms damp and her heart racing. With every step toward Lily's table, she felt the shame of her silence burn a little less. When she reached the girl's side, she laid a trembling hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "I should have said something sooner." Lily looked up, surprised. But in her gaze, Hannah saw no condemnation, only relief and maybe forgiveness. The diner was utterly still, as Hannah straightened her apron and turned to face the boys in the booth. Her voice was no louder than a normal conversation, but it carried across every table. "You're done here," she said, her chin lifting. "You can leave now, and you're not welcome back." Travis opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He rose awkwardly, his friends trailing behind him like shadows. As they slunk past the line of bikers, Hannah felt her hands stop shaking. For the first time that morning, she knew she had done the right thing. Once the boys had slunk out into the blinding sunlight, the bikers slowly relaxed their stance. But the air didn't lose its charge. It simply transformed. Reverend turned back to Lily, and something in his weathered face softened. He knelt beside her wheelchair, bringing his gaze level with hers. And when he spoke, it was with the gentleness of someone who understood how much a moment of kindness could matter. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said simply. "And you don't have to face it alone ever again." His words weren't dramatic. Were plain, steady, and real. And that's what made them feel like a promise. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, the bikers stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder or nodded respectfully, not as if they pitied her, but as if she were an equal, someone whose strength they recognized in their world. Respect wasn't measured by appearances or wealth. It was measured by heart. And by that measure, Lily was the strongest person in the room. The customers watched in awed silence as the men who'd once been whispered about as dangerous showed more decency than the town's so-called pillars ever had. For Lily, the shame of that morning finally eased, replaced by the warmth of being seen, really seen, and valued. Outside, the boys hovered by their truck, their bravado in tatters. Travis's face was red and his hands kept twisting nervously. For a moment he looked like he might climb in and speed off. But the truth was, he knew that if he left without saying anything, the stain of what he'd done would follow him longer than any of his father's money could protect him. So he swallowed hard, glanced at his friends, and turned back to the diner door. He pushed it open just enough to see inside. His voice was thin, but it carried. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. He stopped because even he knew that wasn't true. Reverend didn't say a word. Neither did Hannah nor the other bikers. It was Lily who finally lifted her gaze to meet Travis's. Her eyes were clear, her voice quiet but unshaken. "I know you didn't mean to be kind," she said, "but you chose to be cruel." The words were not shouted. They were soft and sad. And somehow, that made them hit harder. Travis looked away, unable to meet her gaze. No one spoke to him again. He turned and trudged back to the truck, climbing inside like a man twice his age, already weighed down by the memory of what he'd done. And somehow, that felt like the only apology that mattered, one he'd never forget. When the boys finally drove off, the diner remained suspended in a hush so deep it was almost reverent. Slowly, life began to seep back in. The clink of dishes, the creak of the counter stool, as Hannah sat down to catch her breath. But nothing felt quite the same. In the span of an hour, the town had been forced to look at itself without excuses. They had watched a girl stand up with more courage than any of them. And they had seen strangers, men with leather vests and fierce reputations. For her, the dignity she deserved when no one else would. It was a lesson that would echo through those walls long after the engines faded. That afternoon, people told the story over backyard fences and phone calls. Some tried to twist it, claiming the bikers had overreacted. Others were honest enough to admit they had failed to act themselves. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one would ever forget the look on Lily's face when she realized she was not alone. In that diner, a dividing line had been drawn. From that day forward, mocking someone for being different would carry a price. And while the Hells Angels would eventually ride away, their example would remain a reminder of how respect once demanded could transform a place forever. Long after the bikers had climbed back onto their motorcycles and roared down Main Street, Lily remained by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The shame and fear that had clung to her like a second skin were gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. She didn't want to be pitied. She didn't want to be anyone's cause. All she'd ever wanted was to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. And for the first time, she believed she deserved it. Reverend had called her little sister, a simple phrase that somehow made her feel like she belonged to something bigger. Family that didn't care whether she could walk or not. Hannah brought her a fresh cup of coffee on the house, her eyes shining. "If you ever need anything," she said softly, "you come straight to me." Lily managed a small, grateful smile. She sipped her coffee and looked out the window as the last glint of chrome disappeared into the summer haze. In her heart, she carried the promise that no matter how many people tried to make her feel small, she would always remember this day, the day strangers had become protectors, the day her voice had been enough. And as she finally wheeled herself toward the door, she felt certain of one thing. She would never again be the girl nobody wanted to see. If the story moved you even half as much as it moved me, let me know in the comments below. What would you have done if you'd been sitting in that diner? Do you believe true respect is earned or given freely? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us why we should never judge too quickly. If you found value in this video, give it a thumbs up. It really helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the loudest lesson comes on the back of a roaring engine, a quiet word, or a simple act of seeing someone for who they truly are. The day had started like any other, with ordinary routines and small-town life humming along without interruption. But for Lily, it would be remembered as the day her world shifted. 1 hour had changed everything. 1 hour had transformed fear into courage, helplessness into belonging. She had learned that strength wasn't always loud, and protection didn't always wear a badge or uniform. Sometimes it came from unexpected places, from people who chose to act when others stayed silent. Outside the diner, the summer sun continued to blaze, the chrome of the motorcycles gleaming like mirrors in the heat. The Hells Angels had departed, leaving behind only the echoes of their engines and the memory of what they represented. Unwavering respect. And a lesson that cruelty cannot stand when confronted with conscience and courage. Inside, the customers gradually returned to their meals, conversations resuming with a softness that wasn't there before. Many felt changed, uneasy with their own previous inaction. They'd witnessed an undeniable truth. Ignoring injustice makes everyone complicit. Some offered quiet apologies to Lily, others simply nodded, silently acknowledging the lesson learned. But Lily no longer needed their pity. She felt the quiet power of being seen and valued, a feeling that would stay with her long after the din of engines faded. Hannah wiped down the tables, a subtle smile tugging at her lips. She had finally done what she should have done hours ago. She had witnessed the impact of courage not just Lily's, but Reverend's. In the bikers, and it reminded her that standing up for someone, no matter how daunting, was always the right choice. Lily slowly rolled to the door, pausing for a moment to glance back at the diner. It felt different now, like the air itself had shifted. She had endured humiliation and cruelty, but she had also experienced kindness and protection from strangers who had treated her with the dignity she deserved, and that made all the difference. As she wheeled herself out into the sunlit street, Lily carried more than relief. She carried pride, self-respect, and the unwavering knowledge that she would never again be invisible to those who mattered. The town, too, had changed that day. No longer could mockery and cruelty be overlooked. Lessons had been delivered quietly and powerfully, and their echoes would linger for a long time. In the end, it wasn't just about one girl, one diner, or 1 hour. It was about respect, humanity, and the courage to act when it counts. And for Lily, that day would remain a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of cruelty, dignity and courage could prevail, and sometimes it takes only a few to remind the many.